At Home with Walter Woodbury. This is a talk about you can do a Woodburytype at home with very little equipment. In the 19th century, when photography was invented, there were two big scientific endeavors. One was how to make a photographic print permanent, and the other one was how to distribute the pictures. And the so-called Woodburytype was the first one who was commercially successful, and for about 35 years, so from the mid 1860s to 1900s, it was one of the main processes to replicate photographic pictures, so of the royalties, of weddings, visiting cards, and so on. Then it was replaced by lithography, because the big disadvantage of Woodburytype is that you cannot print text and image at the same time. So you have to print the image separate because of the method. It has to be handled post-processed quite a bit, and it became too expensive and too slow. So I will show you how to do it analog, because I have my philosophical problems with a Woodburytype based on digital methods. The Woodburytype is a continuous tone print. There are no dots, no pixels in it, and it's against my beliefs that you should get to that by using digital files, which are pixelated, then CNC mill the files into a plate. It's again a digital process. It relies on steps. So it's really not to my liking. But most practitioners, and there are not many, who print Woodburytype, they do the CNC milling. So this one is really a little bit an odd one out. So just first a few words about the original Woodburytype. And the one I will present to you is very close to the original Woodburytype, but with modern materials. So when Woodbury did it, he flowed a solution of collodion on a clean glass plate, and then on top of it he poured warm gelatin, which was dichromated and therefore light sensitive. So then he peeled this layer off the glass plate and poured the collodion layer in contact with a negative, and then exposed it via the sun. So similar to how we will do it. So by exposing the collodion layer to the sun, the gelatin was hardening from the base upwards. And then exactly what will happen later, what you will later. So you build up a relief. So the light, or the negative where the light were, where it was clear, most light went through it, and you have the highest hardened gelatin in that area. Where it's black, not much light is going through, almost nothing, and the gelatin stays soft. So Woodbury washed it off and then used this hardened gelatin to do an imprint into a lead plate, and from this lead plate he printed his pictures, again in gelatin, this time pigmented gelatin with carbon black or soot or however you want to call it. So the Woodburytype is extremely archival, because there is nothing which can deteriorate except the gelatin. So when it becomes wet, it will swell, it can get moldy, so it can be destroyed, but it's absolutely light fast. To prevent change by humidity, Woodbury hardened the gelatin either by putting a layer of shellac on it or by using a loam to harden the gelatin itself. So now let's look at the modern method. So I work with analog cameras just because on an analog film you have a continuous tone picture as well, and the resolution of any analog film is so much higher than any digital film. So you get a really, really good continuous tone. For Woodbury, I would recommend to use a medium-sized camera, medium format camera, and a quite slow film. So 50 to 100 ISO, because then the grain is really, really fine. Another option is to use a 35mm film. Here it's with a HP5, which is a relatively fast film with 400 ISO, which can become grainy in low lighting conditions. So I use this method for another photopolymer process. But you know, if you only want to take one camera and only one type of film, it will work as well. So when you have exposed your film, of course, it's not like with a digital camera. You can't just see it on your computer. You have to process it. So you have to take it out of the camera. You have to load it in your development tank, which is in the middle of the picture. And I must say, only recently, I bought myself a large changing bag where you can sit on the sofa. Your tank goes into the bag, your film goes into the bag, and you can put it on the spiral, the white spiral you see, without stumbling around in the dark. And I thought, why didn't I do that earlier? Why did I stumble for 40 years in the dark and was fighting with the film and everything when I can sit comfortably on the sofa? So that is something I can thoroughly recommend that you get it. It makes life really much easier. So when you have your negatives, and you can change, for example, how hard the contrast of your negative will be by using different developers, but that could be a different talk. Anyway, you want to go for a negative with a good grayscale, so not too hard, more on the soft side. Then you need to do more darkroom work by taking the negative and making a positive on a so-called lith film, which is again a photographic film meant for lithography, but we use it for Woodburytype. So we use here positives because we will print directly from the photopolymer plate. If you wanted to take a silicon cast from your photopolymer plate, then you would need to do a negative, because what you do, you have to create a relief where your lightest parts are the highest in your plate for the Woodburytype print. So there squeeze all the gelatin out. So if you take a cast of the photopolymer plate, then you have your lightest parts to be the lowest in your relief. But we will work directly from the photopolymer plate, so we need a positive. So here's an example. I use sort of relatively small less film at the moment simply because of the cost. The photopolymer plates are not exactly cheap, and the less film neither. So you keep it small just until you have learned the method thoroughly and you know you won't make too many mistakes. So that will save you quite a bit of money. And here is it. How dark should it be? So normally when you develop any photographic picture, you say you need a proper dark in your picture, so a proper plaque. When you do that, you get the film on your left. And this is photographed in reflection on a white piece of paper. And you see it's really quite dark, and it won't work for the Woodburytype. It's too dark. Even if you expose the plate for a long time, you don't get enough highlights, so it doesn't harden enough in the lighter sections. So what you have to do for the Woodburytype, you have to expose so it's slightly underexposed, so it's too light for a proper photographic picture. So that is the one on the right. So this is again, a manipulation step in the whole process where you can choose how contrasty your final print should be. And by the way, write everything down. I think people who work in the lab or in the studio, they know how quickly you can forget. I can even forget within 10 minutes what I had just done before. So it's really good practice to write everything down. And then you need a contact frame. So this is a home-built contact frame I simply collected when we had to leave the university. You can buy commercial ones as well, but this I like a lot because the glass plate is actually very heavy. So it makes a very good contact between your lith film and your photopolymer plate. When you do exposures, for example, with a big exposure unit for like for screen printing or lithography, you have often vacuum, which will put the film and your plate in close contact. But here the weight of the glass plate is good enough. So you load this contact frame, and the photosensitive film or this layer on your plate goes face down because you expose from the back. So that is now, in this picture, you see the back of the plate, the mylar film, the transparent mylar film facing upwards. So you cannot use the normal flexo plates, which have an aluminium backing, because you need to expose from the back through the transparent substrate. You cannot expose from the front because you will not get the relief you need for Woodburytype. So the best thing is for sun exposure to do it midday. And I learned it the hard way, that you have the UV index. I shouldn't have forgotten because I had one small children and you shouldn't put them into the sun midday. But I did forget. And when you have in June and July, the so-called UV index is 10, between 12 and 1 o'clock, and it rapidly declines to 3 at about 4 o'clock. So you would need to expose 3 times the amount you did at midday. Yeah, and I learned it by doing a plate, and I washed everything off. So don't do that. So I'm working now on a big table where you can relate the time of year, the time of day to the intensity of the sun, and then your exposure time. That will be fun. So after you have, let me just go back one slide. After you have to expose your plate, you cover it up. So the exposure time is quite long. So it's between 20 and 40 minutes, depending whether you have a cloudy sky or not, and depending on the density of your negative. So the first thing, before you do the full plate, you will do test strips like you do in photography to test how long you need to expose your plate. So the washing or the developing is very easy. You cover first your plate with I use a piece of neoprene rubber, and then either you wait until it's dark, or you have a bathroom with no windows, and you could develop it in your bathtub by putting a tray with water into the bathtub. You then first let the plate soak for a minute, and then you start washing it. I wash it with a sponge. Do not forget to wear goggles and gloves, because you will notice it smells quite strongly and the stuff is irritating, but otherwise harmless. So you can pour it out and sink. That's not a problem. So now the washing is another critical step, how you can change the contrast on your plate, because the longer you wash, the more polymer you take off in the dark areas, the deeper the steps are, but you are losing grayscale as well, because the polymer, the photopolymer, is never completely cured, and it's hydrophilic. It likes water, so it will swell. When you do photogravure, you wash for about a total of 3 minutes. I sometimes wash for the Woodburytype for about 10 minutes, but you need experience for that. So you need to play around with it, because sometimes you can overwash. So you wash the whole layer of dark photopolymer off, and then you get a super hard contrast. It works, but it loses the main advantage of Woodburytype, which is a very soft grayscale and a very good mid-tone range. But that's really up to you how you want to do that. So now, as I said, the photopolymer plate is hydrophilic. It likes water. The photopolymer never completely cures. That means it always swells when it comes into contact with water. To print off it, and using a water-based ink like the pigmented gelatin used in Woodburytype, you have to make sure that your photopolymer doesn't swell. So I use Subterra varnish, and this recipe was given to me by Frank Menger, and he knows it from other historic photographic processes, and it works really well. So I thought the name is cool anyway. Subterra varnish. So you need to make the varnish, you need ethyl alcohol, ethanol, 95%, and then you need 7 grams of Subterra resin and 5 milliliters of lavender oil. Lavender oil is a really good solvent, and it's not really an oil. You mix that, and depending on where you got your Subterra resin from, I got it from eBay, it's a little bit dirty. You have to filter it, but that's not a big thing. So then you coat your photopolymer plates, and I found that about 2 coats are enough. It dries relatively quickly, and the plates are ready for printing. Because it's on a mylar substrate, they tend to curl. So for a good print, I stick them down, because otherwise you have this upwards curling plate and your gelatin will go anywhere. So I tape them down. This is perhaps one of the disadvantages of working with the mylar backed flexoplate, that they curl when they are cured. So the next step is you have to make your ink, and that's a little bit a dark art when you didn't take your chemicals from the university like I did, because I just took what I could get hold of. So I ordered from eBay pork gelatin and fish gelatin because it has different plumes. Plume is basically a measure for how stiff the gelatin is when it gels. So the higher the plume number, the stiffer the gelatin is. So 300 plume is, I think, the stiffest gelatin you can get. So I ordered pork gelatin with 230 plume, with 300 plume, and then fish gelatin with 120 plume, just to see what the influence of the gelatin strength is on the reproduction of the Woodburytype. So then I just took as a pigment in my ink, I simply took pelican ink because I had it in the house. So of course I don't know what's in the ink, so it's a little bit hit off and miss to get the right ink concentration. So Damien Walter and I, we have a paper how to scientifically determine how much carbon plugs or how much carbon particles you need in your ink to get the maximum contrast. But when you can't get hold of it, you have to do it by trial and error. That's exactly the same what Woodbury did. So when you have your ink, so for the first 10 prints roughly, you can use the plate as it is, just varnished. But then you need to oil it just to get a really good release of the gelatin layer from your plate and a good transfer to the paper. So I use shea oil. I like the name. When we do it at the university with CNC milled plates, we use lavender oil, but lavender oil is in the Subterra varnish, and I didn't want to use it because I was afraid I could wipe the varnish off. So shea oil I bought because I like the name, and it's for horses. You put it on their fur to make them look shiny for horse shows and so on. I simply like the name, and it works really well. It's a quite thin oil, and it doesn't leave any smear on the plate, and it gives a very good release. Then you pour a generous amount of gelatin on your plate. Don't be stingy. Just, it's a good amount because you want it to spread evenly on the whole plate. If you put too little, you will not get a complete coverage. So what you have to make sure as well is that you have the lowest amount of bubbles on sitting on your surface. So that will ideally, and I have an ultrasound bars at home, you mix your ink in the ultrasound bars because then you drive the bubbles out, you drive the air out of your ink. The ink becomes better the more often you use it, but the bubbles you can't ever get the ink completely bubble free. And when you look at historic Woodbury types, you can see the bubbles. It doesn't matter too much unless they're really big. So you can blow the bubbles off, or you can use a little pipette. So remove as many bubbles as you can. Then you put the paper on, and actually I use mostly highly calendared normal paper you would use for printing. You can use digital photographic paper that works quite well as well, but Woodbury used normal paper, and I wanted to stick to the original procedure, and it really works well. Then I cover it simply with a piece of plastic, and then I put the weight on. And here it's really quite important that you work fast. So when you are an old physicist, as I am, you have an optical base plate in your garage, which weighs already a lot, and then you put everything you can find on, and you put it on as fast as possible. You need at least 25 kilograms of weight, and the speed makes a difference. If you are too slow, then your gelatin will set, and it will not go into the finest detail, and the image looks out of focus. So speed is the essence. I've just ordered a so-called nipping press. I got it for £100, including postage. It comes from Czechoslovakia. So it hasn't arrived yet, but this will make the whole process much faster. It's really important that you pile up the stuff fast. So here you see on the picture the difference it makes in the Plume. So on your left hand side is 300 Plume, and on the right hand side it's 100 Plume gelatin. And you can see that the left hand side is much more blurry. So as I said, the 300 Plume will set earlier and will become stiffer, and the 120 Plume will simply set later, and it's much more elastic as well. So that's the reason why you get a more blurry picture with the 300 Plume. If you are really fast, it won't make much of a difference. But as you have seen, or I can go back, I'm working on stone plates. So the stone plates are quite cold, which is an advantage because you need a colder temperature to make the gelatin set within about 5 minutes. If it's a really hot summer, which it was last year, we couldn't get the gelatin to set. So I had a project with a student, Josie. We were standing in the studio for half an hour and the stuff wouldn't set. So above 25 degrees Celsius, you stand no chance to get the gelatin to set within a day. So that's why partly Woodburytype was a little bit difficult or didn't really take off in hot countries. So the other thing is, I think that is a really cool effect. So I took the fresh prints outside to take pictures, and I left this 120 Plume fish gelatin print on the floor for a minute in the sun and it starts bubbling up. It looks like it boils. I think it looks cool, but don't do it. If you want to save your print, don't expose it to the sun or any heat. Yeah, and here you see some different results with really not so much difference in ink concentration. So on your left side, you see ink which with 0.75 milliliter of ink per 100 grams of gelatin solution, so water and gelatin. So you have normally 20 weight% of gelatin and 80 weight% of water, and then a dash of ink, and then on the right side is 0.5 milliliter of ink per 100 grams of water. So I think the left side is much better because I get a proper plug, whereas on the right side I don't have a plug. And the other thing is it's really, really important to use the Subterra varnish, because I thought I'll give it a go, and I just use the Shire oil and varnish the photopolymer plate and see whether it gives a good enough layer between the photopolymer and the gelatin, but it doesn't release properly. It simply doesn't work. So the varnishing is important when you print directly from the Woodburytype. And that's it. Thank you. And that's the Woodburytype team. It's Walter Guy, who helps to build a lot, Frank Menger, who is an accomplished photographer, Damien Leach, my postdoc, and by now an expert in Woodburytype as well. Thank you and have fun. And don't forget to pour yourself a good, nice drink whilst you're waiting for the exposure. Thank you. Bye.